Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week we feature the last in our series of conversations from our trip to FreedomFest in June in Palm Springs, and we're pleased to be joined by Kerry McDonald. Kerry is one of the nation's top education policy experts. She's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where she leads the Education Entrepreneurship Lab. She's the host of the very popular Liberated podcast. She's also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network, and she's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and she writes for Forbes.com and the 74. And in her spare time, she's written a new book called Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. And you can get a copy of her book at your favorite online bookseller. And the book, which is a very interesting read, talks about entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are responding to a growing demand that certainly grew during the COVID-19 pandemic for learning models that really focused on meeting the individual needs of students and challenged the education status quo. And so in profiling these parents and teachers, we'll learn about things like micro schools and learning pods and homeschooling collaboratives and online learning networks and other educational models that are much more flexible than the traditional status quo, that are providing specialized individual education and often at a lower cost than traditional private schools. So we talk about some of the people that she profiles in her book, and we also talk about some of the other hot issues in education policy today, like the efforts to downsize the U.S. Department of Education. It's a very interesting discussion, and as kids are going back to school this week, it's a very timely discussion of how to really make education serve the individual needs of students much better than it does today. So after this message, we invite you to sit back and enjoy my conversation direct from FreedomFest 2025 in Palm Springs with Kerry McDonald. Thanks for listening. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates, so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Kerry, it's great to have you back on Next Round here at FreedomFest in Palm Springs.
It's great to be here, Tim. FreedomFest is one of my favorite conferences of the year, so it's delightful to be here and great to talk to you.
And I've never been before, and it's a lot of fun. So hopefully our listeners will come next year. We will entice them. The people like us are hanging out at FreedomFest.
Yes, it's a great place to be.
So it's great to have you on now to talk about all these education debates we're having at the national level, really at the state level too this year. So maybe we could start with a 30,000-foot view question. We're several months into the Trump 47 administration. To say they're moving at lightning speed on things is an understatement, and really they want to reshape federal education policy. And we've seen probably their most high-profile reform effort has been, well, we've talked about for years on our side of the aisle, shut down the Department of Education, which, of course, our friends in the education status quo are saying the sky is falling at the thought of this. But it kind of begs the question, and it's something you've written about, what would really happen if the Department of Education was eliminated?
Yeah, it's such a great and timely question, Tim. I think the first thing to remember is there is no constitutional role for the federal government in education. And when the U.S. Department of Education came on the scene in 1980, it was sort of flawed from the start. Prior to that, there was an Office for Education that basically administered in small ways some of the federal programs, things like IDEA for students with disabilities, Title I programs for low-income families, that sort of thing. And that legislative component of the U.S. Department of Education remains. So the legislation isn't going anywhere. IDEA, for children with disabilities, or Title I, those are legislative directives. But there's not a compelling reason in my mind that we need the U.S. Department of Education administering these programs. And in fact, they may be better served in other places, such as the Justice Department, for example, dealing with students with disabilities. The larger point is that education is a state issue. And thankfully, the federal government, from a funding perspective, has a relatively small role in U.S. K-12 education. Just under 15% of overall K-12 public school spending is coming from the federal government. Now that's inched up in recent years. Not too long ago it was below 10%, so that's something to be watchful for. And I think some of the efforts by the Education Secretary to peel back some of the administrative bloat within the department should be commended, because we do want less spending at the federal level in education and much more responsibility and autonomy at the state and local level, which is where education constitutionally should be focused.
Kind of leading the charge of this whole movement is Education Secretary Linda McMahon, which there are many eyebrows raised when she was appointed of, is she the right gal to do this? And so you see under her leadership, they're making this ongoing, long overdue education reform moves at the national level. How do you evaluate the job she's doing and the things that they're doing? And maybe what are one or two things that you would recommend to the Secretary should be the top priorities for the administration in trying to enact the changes we've all wanted to see at the federal level for so long?
Yes, I think it's also important to remember that to successfully disband the U.S. Department of Education would take an act of Congress. And I don't know that will happen anytime soon, but certainly setting the tone for reducing the size and scope of the federal government's role in education is worthy. That said, I think that some of the things that are coming out of the Trump administration at the federal level regarding education we should be concerned about. It seems like in some ways there could be the education secretary or the Trump administration talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? Let's reduce the size and scope of the federal role in education, while at the same time, for example, they are looking for a federal tax credit for school choice policies. That should not be something at the federal level. That is a state and local issue. So sort of keeping that principle in mind of limited government, individual freedom, and states' rights, I think is really important for the future of K-12 education policy. And while those of us who certainly champion school choice policies, for example, it's hard for us to maybe turn our backs against federal school choice policy, because it is a policy we support generally, but it should not come from the federal government. And again, the more that you're expanding the size and scope of the federal government's role in education, the harder it is to peel back that role when inevitably we have a different administration with different political priorities in office. So I think more of this trimming the department, reducing administrative bloat, those kinds of things that the Secretary is working on, I think are worthwhile. I think another area for the current state of the U.S. Department of Education to be focused on are the areas where they do have authority. These would be military families, Department of Defense schools, and there are some efforts underway to expand school choice policies for military families. I think that's excellent and should be expanded. The federal government also oversees Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. That's another area where they could encourage more choice. And the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., which the federal government has jurisdiction over. So again, expanding school choice policies there would be something of a priority.
When you think about widespread federal policies and regulations in areas like homeschooling, for example. That could be very harmful in the long run if you have a bad federal administration. So what are some of these areas where, boy, they really should be cautious here? You don't want to stir up a hornet's nest, because I think we kind of saw in the Biden administration, they looked at what Trump administration 1 did and they said, oh, we'll pick up the baton and go 180 degrees in a different way.
So right before the 2020 election, I had written an article at fee.org saying that if you don't want a Biden 1619 commission, you should oppose Trump's 1776 commission, basically making the point that the federal government should not have a role in curriculum and policies related to what students are learning across the United States. That should be a state and local issue as it's constitutionally defined. And yet again, we saw at the beginning of the Trump administration's term now an executive order for mandatory patriotic education. This is not something that the federal government should be involved in, and we should be devolving that authority to the states.
So let's talk about your book. You have a terrific new book called Joyful Learning, which our listeners can get at their favorite bookseller. And it shares the experiences of who you call, and I love this term, educational entrepreneurs, who are really reimagining learning in our communities through things like, and a lot of things I learned here preparing for this interview, micro schools, homeschooling learning collaboratives, and online learning networks. So tell us a little bit about your book and the overall premise, and why were you inspired to write it?
Yes, thanks, Tim. The book is called Joyful Learning, How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling, being published by the big New York City publisher Hachette, which I think, just as an aside, is a sign that the sort of cultural winds are shifting regarding education, and especially school choice policies, because the book is filled with examples of founders and families who are leveraging state-based school choice policies that enable young people to find just the right educational fit for them. So I think it's, again, a good signal that, I often think publishing is downstream of culture, and I think it's a good signal that that this topic is now top of mind in the publishing world. So I decided to write the book because over the past several years, I've been profiling these everyday education entrepreneurs who are building the innovative learning models, new schools and spaces that families really want all across the U.S. I started my podcast in February of 2022, the Liberated Podcast, to interview these founders. Initially, the podcast was a once-a-week endeavor, but within 6 months, I had such a backlog of founders that I had to boost it to twice a week, and now I have over 300 episodes and still a backlog, because there's just that many entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are creating these new schools. So it's really an exciting time, and I felt that there was an opportunity to share these stories in a broader way and kind of tie in the themes around education, entrepreneurship, innovation, and choice in a book that's really geared towards both families and founders. So families seeking creative schooling options in their communities, what to look for, how to find these programs, and founders and prospective founders who are building or growing these new educational models.
What I think is great is the people that you profile and the discussion in your book about all these alternatives to traditional public schools that many parents may not know about. And I think what's interesting in this entrepreneurship movement is really the innovation in education that you're seeing. But as you write in the book, government regulations, not surprisingly, are making it difficult for educational entrepreneurs to thrive, even constraining their efforts in some cases. So share what you learned here from some of the people that you talked with for your book, and what would be the ideal policy mix to encourage a spirit of educational entrepreneurship?
Well, I think it's important to remember that entrepreneurs face regulatory roadblocks in every sector. But in education in particular, it's much more of a regulatory maze for these founders, especially founders who are building innovative, emerging schooling models that don't look anything like traditional schools, public or private. So when we talk about microschools or these intentionally small, highly individualized learning communities that sometimes operate as homeschooling collaboratives, other times operate as small private schools, they don't look anything like a traditional school. And yet these founders are encountering regulations meant for 1,000-student schools, things like needing to do traffic studies or curb height when they're looking at locations. There's examples of founders who are opening with 10 kids in a commercial space or even a residential home, and have to spend $100,000 for a commercial fire sprinkler system. Which just is a no-go, right? I mean, they can't even get started because of some of these regulations. So I think it's important to look at existing regulations around small business owners, because these are small business owners, but more importantly, regulations around education to enable more of these programs to get started. And we're seeing some of that happen. For example, in Utah, the Utah legislature in 2024 passed a zoning law that essentially enabled microschools to operate in all zones, meaning residential, commercial, and agricultural, the same way that public schools are able to operate in all of those zones, which was a huge win because a lot of times these school founders are forced into these undesirable commercial locations on busy streets with no outdoor access, because that's the only thing available to them. Well, a zoning change that enables them to operate in more residentially zoned areas can really make for a wonderful schooling environment for these kids. And what that law did almost immediately is protect some founders who were being badgered by local zoning officers and local regulatory boards. They had to back off. But it, more importantly, encouraged new founders to get started. I talked with one founder, Jenny Jones, who runs the Treehouse Agile Learning Center in St. George, Utah. She works closely with me at FEE. And she talks about how the combination of Utah passing a universal school choice policy that applies to all K-12 students in the state in terms of eligibility, along with this microschooling zoning law, were the key factors that led her to launch her in-home microschool in the fall of 2024. And now she's grown so much that she is leaving her home to go to a larger, more commercial space. But like small business owners in all sectors, we need to provide that opportunity to get started without onerous and often sort of incompatible regulations.
Right. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So one of the things that I've learned working at PRI, working with our Lance Azumi and reading the great work that you do, the myth busting on homeschooling, and the book that Lance wrote, The Homeschool Boom, you have this image of what homeschooling is, and it's so not that. You know, things like, how would you teach your kids calculus and you're not a math major? You have cohorts and there are ways you can do it. And what's been great to see since the pandemic, right, is that it was people's first exposure to how bad your kids' traditional school was when they watched Zoom school, and that the popularity of homeschooling has really kept up pretty well. So 5 years after the pandemic and this, I think, eye-opening experience for American parents, where do you see the homeschooling movement today, and where do you see it going in the future? And what are some of the challenges that homeschooling parents continue to face, after all this time?
Yes. So, homeschooling was growing in popularity pre-2020, as I documented in my 2019 book, Unschooled, and there was a lot of sort of diversification of the homeschooling population throughout the first couple of decades of the new millennium as more families were attracted to the more individualized nature of homeschooling. What happened, as you say, beginning in the spring of 2020, when parents got a glimpse of what was happening in their children's classrooms and schools were shut down for many months, remote learning was not working for many students, parents began to take matters into their own hands and started looking around at what else was available to them in terms of education options, and discovered this whole world of homeschooling that they didn't know existed. And many of them in 2020, many of these parents started creating these pandemic pods, which looked a lot like homeschool co-ops of yesteryear, right? These are just spontaneous groups of parents getting together to share curriculum resources, help with teaching and learning in different homes. And many of those pandemic pods emerged or have evolved into full-fledged microschools, private schools, all kinds of different innovative learning programs that really originated at that moment. So you're right that homeschooling remains above pre-pandemic levels. It's increased more than 50% since 2019. And it's continuing to grow. So we saw a huge burst, obviously, in 2020 at the peak of school closures and pandemic policy, a more than doubling of the homeschool population in that year, a 5-fold increase in the number of Black homeschooling families that year. And while we're not still at that peak level of 2020, homeschooling continues to, again, be above pre-pandemic levels and growing. So, for example, Angela Watson is a professor at Johns Hopkins University who runs the Homeschool Hub there. And she's found in data that she looked at for states that report homeschooling data, in 2023, the fall of 2023, in 90% of the states that, again, shared these data, homeschooling numbers were above what they were the year prior in 2022. And at this point, schools are back to normal. This isn't a pandemic era trend. There's something else going on here. And I think that something else going on is that parents are really seeking the personalization and individualization in education that they enjoy in all other parts of their lives, but have until now not really found in education. So they're demanding that as parents, and then these entrepreneurial parents and teachers are going off and building the schools and spaces that these parents want, so there's more options available to them. And then you add on the accelerant that is school choice policies that apply to many of these creative schooling options in many states, and that is what's truly transforming K-12 education.
So you recently wrote an article where you talked about the concerns that many homeschool parents have over the movement to expand school choice policies like ESAs in states like Texas. And there's a concern over whether this is an expansion of government power into their freedom to educate their kids in what they think is the best way. And you've argued that homeschool parents shouldn't fear this movement and these policies. So what's your message to them?
Well, first, we always have to be vigilant about regulation and be pushing back against any kind of regulation that impedes a parent's right to choose the best educational environment for their children, including homeschooling. But I think the larger point to remember is the way it stands now, states can and do regulate education, including private education, which includes homeschooling. So take my state of Massachusetts, for example, where we have no private school choice programs. We are also one of the states that is the most highly regulated when it comes to homeschooling. So, this is an example where often the states that have that don't have private school choice programs are often among the most regulated states in terms of private education and homeschooling. You take examples of other states, I use the example of Wyoming, for example, which just this year passed universal school choice at the same time that it deregulated homeschooling by now enabling Wyoming homeschooling families to not report that they're homeschooling their children. So they're now, I think, one of 15 states that doesn't require parents to report to the state that they're homeschooling their children. These bills were passed in tandem, within a week or two of each other, showing that you can expand school choice programs and deregulate homeschooling. And in fact, we're seeing more of that trend in states that have robust school choice programs than in states that don't.
So you also write in your book, and we've mentioned it a couple of times, about a learning model that many parents may not be familiar with, micro schools. So for those who, maybe this is the first time they're hearing about them, what are micro schools and why are they so promising in the effort to provide more individualized learning opportunities for students? And share some of what you learned in your book, and also why they're great opportunities for teachers too.
Yes. So microschooling is really a catch-all term to describe highly individualized, learner-centered educational models or educational learning communities that often have flexibility in terms of scheduling, personalized curriculum that's there to meet each child's needs. So instead of sort of the top-down, one-size-fits-all curriculum that every fourth grader would have to know in a traditional classroom, in microschools, there's much more differentiated curriculum, recognizing that each child, in this case, say each fourth grader, might come into school with different mastery levels in different subjects. And they might be behind in math and ahead in reading, so they should have curriculum meeting them where they're at to help them close achievement gaps. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these microschools, that often founders, and I'll say here, most of the founders, more than 3/4 of the founders that I interview, and this is backed up by data from the National Microschooling Center, most of these founders are former public school teachers who grow disillusioned with the one-size-fits-all model in the classrooms that they're in and decide that they can do things better. So they're seeing in microschools the way in which that individualized attention, that differentiated curriculum can take students who are often behind grade level when they enter a microschool and very quickly catch up to their grade level and in many cases surpass their grade level in terms of achievement because they have a curriculum that's meeting them where they're at. So it's, these microschools I think are really shaking up U.S. education in positive and profound ways. And even though the term is micro, and some of them are very small, with a dozen kids, maybe up to 50 kids, a lot of times founders will start with the idea that they'll create a microschool or a small school, but very quickly outgrow their space. As I mentioned earlier, Jenny Jones, I talk in Joyful Learning in the new book about a founder, former public school teacher in Wichita, Kansas, who had every intention of creating a very small school, fewer than 30 students. She quit her job as a longtime public school teacher to open her microschool, but ended up with over 130 students right out of the gate.
Wow.
Because there was so much demand for what she was building there. So sometimes founders might have visions of being small to start and realize very quickly that there's outsized demand for what they're building.
So as we close, let's talk about a topic in your book that is an important topic for us at PRI with our upcoming movie Graduation Day that will be released later this year, and that's on apprenticeship programs and career tech training. One of the schools we profile in our film is P-Tech Academy in Colorado Springs, which provides great career tech training for their students as an alternative to a traditional college. Even you see in the film they have a project where they build a house at the school. You write in your book about the growth in apprenticeship programs and micro-credential programs that are so important to preparing students for the workforce as an alternative to college. So talk about this growing movement that, well, we don't want to have a knock on traditional college, but it's an important alternative for a trained workforce and to address this growing college debt problem.
Right, and I wrote about this recently in my column at the 74, talking about the growing popularity of apprenticeships, micro-credentialing, as you mentioned. I think the key is to look at ways that we can expand the pathways to adulthood, which could include, for many students, college, community college, or four-year college degree. But increasingly, young people are attracted to other pathways, and we should make accessing those pathways easier and more desirable for them. If you look at polling of high school students, many of them are saying that they value on-the-job training and professional certificates more than they do a traditional four-year degree, because they realize sort of the practical application to their future career goals. So, I'm excited about this growing interest in apprenticeships. I think making it easier for business owners to hire apprentices, making it easier for young people to access micro-credentialing opportunities, I think is a key priority here. Community colleges are doing a great job sort of meeting this demand that young people have for targeted professional certificate programs that enable them to very quickly get a job that's a high-paying job that could be a springboard to future professional opportunities. So this is a really positive trend, I think, in post-high school education.
Well, Kerry, it was great to get to visit with you here in person at FreedomFest and chat with you about your book. Good luck with your book. I hope it's a great success.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be here.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.